Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in Appalachian history. We're going to look at files that have been locked away for decades in the dirty basement of Y County, Virginia. Tell us where you are watching this because it will make you question everything you think you know about mountain secrets and family curses. The United States went through a lot of changes in 1923. Cities were growing quickly, with lots of tall, noisy buildings and cars. But in the Appalachians, time stands still. They looked like they were stuck in a different time. In Virginia's Misty Mountains, whole families lived alone on land that had been passed down from generation to generation. They farmed tobacco, corn, pigs, and chickens, continuing customs that went back to before the Civil War. In those steep mountains where dirt roads ended in thick oak and pine woods, life had its own rhythm, far from the new things that were making people excited in the coastal cities. People all over knew the Carter family. As the owners of a lot of land in the New River Valley, close to the small town of Ivanhoe, people looked up to them, but they kept a strange space from their closest neighbors. The Carter farm was almost 200 acres of mountainous land, and the main house was made of dark wood that seemed to soak up light even on the brightest days. A deep basement cut right into the rock of the mountain held the building together. It had 3 stories. The house was said to have been built in 1872, not long after the war that split the country in two ended, and that major repairs hadn't been done since then. The windows stayed small and narrow, and the outside walls got darker over time and from the air of the mountains. In 1923, Thomas Carter was the head of the family. He was 58 years old, as tall and thin as a fence post, and had eyes that looked right through you. He got the land from his father, who got it from his grandfather, and so on. There was a long line of Carters that went back to that time, right there in that part of Appalachia. Thomas lived with his 2 adult kids, James and Robert, who are both in their 30s and still single. His wife, Margaret, is 52 years old and very quiet. She was rarely seen outside the house. They also had a cousin far away named Elelanina, who was even stranger than Margaret. The family Morrison lived 3 miles away on the other side of a furry hill and was their closest neighbor. They talked about the Carters in strange ways. They talked about seeing lights early in the morning, looking through windows of homes as if they were looking for something lost. They said that on nights when there was no wind, sounds from the property sounded like chanting or crying, but they could have just been old wood creaking or coyotes howling nearby. A farmer named Mr. Morrison, who was 63 years old and had lived in these woods all his life, swore that his family never went to the Carters' land at night. What made things even more interesting was the Carters kept up a private graveyard on their land. The old iron fence around it made it look more like a cage than a pretty fence. It was on top of a hill. All the Carters who had died since the house was built were buried here. The gravestones were plain. They were just gray stones with names and dates scratched into them in a rough way. The number, though, was strange. Even though there were only a few people in the family, there were at least 27 headstones in that graveyard. Based on county records, some dates showed 3 or 4 family members died in a few months, one after the other. On other headstones, the months and days of death were not written, only the years. There was an event in the winter of that year that meant the Y County records had to be kept secret for almost 80 years. Someone who was just going through the area vanished without a trace, which was the start of everything. Then, a string of disturbing events directly linked the Carter family, revealing family secrets that had been kept hidden for generations. What researchers found on that remote land couldn't be explained logically, and it started a legend that still lives on in the Virginia mountains. We'll find out what really happened on the Carter lands by looking at papers that were only recently found. hearsay that wasn't taken into account at the time, and evidence that didn't make sense back in 1923. This is a story about being alone, dark rituals, and the weight of secrets that have been passed down through generations. Get ready, because we're just beginning to talk about. Bring one of Appalachia's darkest secrets to the surface. In the first week of February 1923, the person went missing, which led to the whole probe. Henry Walsh, a 34-year-old traveling salesman, left the town of Ville on a cold morning with his wagon full of clothes, household items, and drugs that he planned to sell in small mountain towns that were far away from each other. People in the area knew Henry as a trustworthy man who always got back to town on time. He told the owner of the guest house about it, told the house where he was living that he would be back in 4 days, but Henry Walsh was never seen again. Martha Henry, Henry's wife, didn't call the police for 10 days. She knew that mountain roads in the winter were dangerous, and that a broken tire or a snowstorm could make any trip take longer than planned. But when it had been 2 weeks with no news, worry set in. Martha called Daniel Pritchard, the county sheriff. He had been in charge for 16 years and knew every road in the area. Police Chief Pritchard. They put together a search party of 8 local guys who were all experienced mountain hikers and went on Henry's usual route. The abandoned wagon was found in an area about 2 miles away from Carter's land. The vehicle was still whole, and the cargo was still tied under a waxed top. 2 horses were feeding nearby, looking like they were left there on purpose. There were no bloodstains or other signs of a fight, so it wasn't like wild animals had struck. The rear bumper was neatly wrapped around the driver's seat. It looked like Henry had stopped on his own and carefully got off the horse. For hours, police searched the area around the wagon, but they only found tracks that led from the road to it. It looked like Henry Walsh had just disappeared into the cold mountain air. Sheriff Pritchard chose to talk to the people that live in the area. The Carter's house was the closest one. The search group found Thomas Carter on the porch of the big, dark house in the valley when they got there. The head of the family was dressed in. In his dirty work clothes, he looked like he had spent the morning taking care of the yard. He didn't change his face as the sheriff told him why he was there. Thomas said he hadn't seen any street sellers and that his family hadn't left the house in days because it was so cold. His speech was deep and measured, and he spoke slowly and carefully, which made the men feel uneasy. Margaret Carter, a pale, weak woman, briefly appeared in the doorway and looked at the visitors looked at them with blank eyes before leaving the house again. James and Robert, her 2 sons, stayed working in the back of the property and didn't come out to meet the sheriff, which was seen as odd but not necessarily suspicious. Sheriff Pritchard asked Thomas if he could look at the area around the farm, but Thomas kindly said no, saying the property was too big and that they could check it themselves if they saw anything strange. There was no court order that said the search could happen, so the group had to go. Over the next few weeks, more incidents were recorded. A woman from the 15 kilometers north of the Carters' land village of Speedwell said that her husband had seen strange lights coming from the direction of their land for several nights in a row. While driving by the road near the property one foggy afternoon, a farmer said he heard muffled screams. When he went to check it out, he found nothing but quiet. According to a traveling preacher who sometimes preached in rural areas, he had tried. He went to visit the Carter family to offer his services, but James Carter stopped his way at the front door and told him their family did not need prayers from strangers. Sheriff Pritchard started to learn more about the background of the Carter family. He looked at old county records and talked to older people who lived in the area and knew stories that had been told for generations. He found out some troubling things. Since the estate was first built in 1872, there had been a strange trend of deaths in the family. Official papers showed that members of at least 3 generations of the Carter family had died in mysterious ways. Someone Thomas's uncle had lost track of in 1891, and his body was never found. In 1887, 2 aunts died 3 days apart. Both were said to have had fevers, but no doctor was called to confirm. In 1955, a cousin fell off a cliff, but people who saw him said he was very careful and knew every rock in those mountains. Old media from Ville also talked about it. In the 1894 issue, there was a short story about a fire that burned part of Carter's barn and killed 6 animals. A hired hand also died in the fire, but the name of the man who died was not given, and there was no record of a probe afterward. Another issue from 1902 talked about a land dispute between the Carter family and the Dalton family next door. The Daltons said the Carters had built their fence higher than allowed by law, cutting into other people's land. Real estate. The Daltons moved out of the area 2 months after filing the claim, so the case never got to court. Sheriff Pritchard had a strong feeling that something was very wrong with the family, but he didn't have any proof to act on. Henry Walsh's disappearance was still not solved, and the town became more angry. Martha Walsh cried every night because her husband wasn't there, and other travelers started to avoid that mountain road out of fear of the same thing happening. Then, in the middle of March, something that would force the police to finally enter the Carter home. What they found inside would change how people thought about the family forever, and lead to an investigation that would reveal unimaginable horrors that had been kept secret for generations. The success came from somewhere you wouldn't expect it. A faraway cousin named Elelanina Carter lived on the land. On a rainy March afternoon, she went to the Y County Sheriff's Office. She got there on foot by herself, drenched from the rain and trembling from what looked like pure fright. She looked like she had run through thorny bushes because her clothes were torn in several places. Her bare feet were bleeding and left marks on the wooden floor of the station. Sheriff Pritchard knew her right away, even though they had never talked before. Elelanina was 37 years old, but she looked decades older. Her gray hair was tangled and her eyes were droopy and always moving, as if she were waiting for someone to chase her. There was no one else Elelanina would talk to but the sheriff. That's where he took her. She was given a blanket and hot water. It took her almost an hour to start telling her story, and even then, the words came out slowly, and there were long pauses during which she just stared at her hands. Elelanina told them that she had come to the Carter farm 8 years before, in 1915, after her parents died in East Tennessee during a flu epidemic. Margaret Carter's family took her in when Eleanor had no money and nowhere else to go because she was related to Margaret Carter. To begin with, according to Elelanina, everything looked fine. The family was quiet and didn't talk to her, but they didn't do anything that scared her either. She did chores around the house, took care of the yard, and fed the animals. She did start to note some strange patterns, though. At night, Thomas Carter would go down into the basement, dig into the rock, and lock the door behind him. He would not be seen for hours. Margaret would go about her daily tasks without saying a word for whole days. Doing things. James and Robert, her 2 kids, talked to each other in a way that Elelanina couldn't understand. They used words that seemed to come from a different language or a regional dialect that she didn't know. The basement was where all the problems in the house started. It was never okay for Elelanina to go down there. A heavy iron bolt kept the door locked, and Thomas wore the key around his neck on a chain. In the early morning, she could hear sounds coming from down there that she couldn't quite name, but that kept her up all night and tense until morning. Eleanor could hear what sounded like footsteps, dull thumps against stone, and sometimes what seemed like whispering voices, but she couldn't make out the words. The woman looked away when Margaret asked her what was in the basement and said it was just old food and tools that the family had stored for generations. She told the sheriff about the graveyard at the top of the hill. Having hiked there a few times, she was interested in the past of the people who took her in. The ages on the gravestones didn't match up with the family stories Thomas sometimes told. It was said that some uncles and cousins had moved away, but Elelena found gravestones in the graveyard with those names. There were also graves with only a simple wooden cross buried in the ground, and no names at all. When she asked what was going on, James Carter told her in a scary voice to stop asking questions and do her job. The situation got worse. Significantly, after the street seller went missing, Elelena saw that her whole family became even more alert and nervous. Thomas made it clear that no one could leave the land without his permission. People ate their meals in silence, and if they tried to talk, they were met with angry looks. In the middle of the night, Ellen woke up to sounds outside the house. She saw Thomas and his 2 kids walking toward the lanterns that give off a dim light in the graveyard. After staying upstairs for hours, they came down and found that their clothes were covered in fresh dirt. That same week, Elelena decided she had to run away, but someone found her trying to leave. She was packing a small bag of food and clothes when Robert found her. He called her father right away. Thomas pulled her into the main room and put her in a chair in front of the rest of the family. He talked about what he called a family ritual for the first time. That had been in place since Carter the first came to those mountains. Elelena didn't want to go into specifics about what was said, but her hands shook violently as she remembered it, and tears ran down her face as she told the sheriff that Thomas had told her he would bury her in the cemetery with the other people who had tried to tell the family's secrets. Eleanor stayed in her room for a few weeks after that. Only 1 meal a day was brought to her by Margaret, who would quietly go up the stairs and leave the plate on the doormat. It was while Elelena was locked up that she started to hear something that scared her to death. Voices could be heard in the basement, but they weren't Thomas's or her kids. There were other sounds, some faint and far away, and some closer. They all sounded like they were pleading for something that Eleanor couldn't figure out. She put her ear to the room's wooden floor, and the wind howling through the cracks in the old house made it hard to understand what they were saying. The night before she ran away, Elelena used a broken nail she found in a loose floorboard to open the lock on her room. Before she went down the stairs, she made sure no one was awake. Then she snuck out the back door that led to the vegetable yard while trying very hard not to make a sound. She ran in the dark for miles without stopping to look back. She walked through a dark forest by moonlight and tore her clothes on the thorns and lost her shoes in the mud. She didn't stop until dawn, when she saw the first houses of Wytheville. She begged the sheriff to do something before it was too late at the police station. Sheriff Pritchard listened in silence and carefully wrote down what he heard. He knew that he needed more than a woman who had been hurt to testify in order to get a search warrant. But Elelena's story fit what he already thought about the family. He chose to act quickly before the Carters found out Elelena had gotten away and might have destroyed proof. With an emergency order from a county judge, the sheriff got 12 armed men together the next day and went to the Carter property. What would happen in the next few hours would be written down in formal papers that would stay sealed for almost 100 years because they were thought to be too upsetting for the public to see. At noon on a gray Saturday, the group led by Sheriff Pritchard got to the Carter land. There were thick clouds over the Appalachians, and a cold wind came down from the mountains, bringing the smell of rain. The 12 men with the sheriff were all from the county and knew how hard it was to live in this remote area as farmers or traders. Some of them had guns with them, while others only had flashlights and other tools that could help with a thorough search. Everyone was tense because they knew they were invading the privacy of a family that had kept their distance from outsiders for generations. Thomas. He was sitting on the porch, as if he knew they were going to come, Carter. His dark clothes were on point as always, and he had his thin arms crossed over his chest. His face was expressionless. The order was shown to Thomas by the sheriff. He read it slowly, moving his lips as he went over each line. Afterwards, he carefully folded the paper, gave it back to the sheriff, and said just one word that would be written down. "You will feel bad about disrespecting things you don't understand." He didn't sound angry or scared in his voice. It was cold. Several of the men in the group looked at each other with uneasy looks. Margaret Carter watched from a window on the second floor. The foggy glass made her pale figure hard to see. James and Robert came out from the back of the property. Their hands were dirty from work, and they both had angry looks on their faces that they were trying to hide. The sheriff told the family to stay together in the main room with 3 of his men watching over them while the rest of the group began to carefully look at each item. Every room. The search started on the first floor, where they found only things that you would expect to find in a house in the country at that time. There was old, worn-out furniture, a simple kitchen with a wood-burning fire, a pantry with basic foods, wooden chairs in the living room, and a bookcase with Bibles and farming books. The 4 bedrooms on the second floor were all very simple and lacked furniture. Elena's room was exactly what she had said it would be like. The door had nail marks in the wood, and the lock was broken. Clear proof of how desperate she was to get away. Under the bed in Thomas and Margaret's room, police found a locked metal box. When they forced it open, they found old papers like death certificates, property deeds from 1868, and letters written by hand in old writing that was hard to read. One of the men who could read started to look at the letters and saw that many of them talked about something called the Covenant of Stones. Without more information, it was still not clear what they meant. The third floor was mostly an attic that was used to store things. There were boxes full of worn-out clothes, rusty tools, and empty glass jars that had been covered in dust for decades. But there were strange marks cut into one of the dark wood ceiling support beams that no one there could figure out. They were shapes that didn't look like any known alphabet letters, set up in concentric circles around a center point. One person thought they might be markings made by native people, maybe by groups that lived in the area before the Europeans came. Of European residents, but someone else said the wood was clearly carved after the house was built. It was finally time to go down to the basement. The door was locked with the same strong padlock Eleanor had talked about. Thomas wouldn't give up the key, not saying anything even after the sheriff threatened to arrest him for obstructing justice. One of the guys had to use an axe to break the padlock. It took a few hits before the metal finally gave way. When the door opened, a stone staircase was seen, going down into total darkness. The basement gave off a strange smell that was a mix of damp earth, mold, and something else that no one there could quite put their finger on. It made people feel uncomfortable right away. Sheriff Pritchard was the first to go down. He was carrying an oil lantern that made the bare rock walls dance with shadows. 3 men followed him, and each of them had a flashlight with them. There were 28 steps on the stairs, and each one was cut straight into the mountain rock. The ceiling was low, so the taller guys had to hunch over. Backs as they went down. With each step, the temperature dropped. By the time they got to the bottom, it was so cold that their breath made clouds of steam in the still air. They didn't expect the basement to be so big. It wasn't just a place to store things. It was a network of rooms carved into the rock and linked by narrow tunnels that went in different directions. The main room, which was where the stairs stopped, was about 6 meters long and 4 meters wide. The stone walls were made by hand. The floor was uneven and felt damp to the touch. Small streams of water ran down in some spots and formed puddles. But what caught their attention right away were the carefully placed things along the walls. There were wooden shelves with dozens of glass jars on them, and each one had a sign written by hand. They had dates on them from 1873, which is only 1 year after the house was built. There were living things preserved in yellow liquids inside the jars, but the flashlight's dim light made it hard to see, to figure out exactly what they were. There were also stacks of notebooks, some of which were so old that the leather covers were almost falling apart. He took out one of the newest notebooks and started to look through the pages. They were thorough records that had been written in different handwritings over many years and showed something he didn't understand at first. The notes talked about genes, staying pure, and meeting needs every time the moon went around. There were diagrams and pictures of the human body that showed the structure of the underground rooms showed that the basement went much deeper than what they had seen so far. I found it very disturbing that one part talked about feeding the guards without saying who or what they were. In a 1919 entry, the arrival of the 23rd was reported. This word was used many times in the records without being clearly explained. One of the guys who had been exploring the side passages shook his head and called out to the sheriff. He had found. There was a second, smaller room with more of the strange symbols they had seen cut in the attic. These symbols were much more complicated and were painted with a dark paint that had held up against the humidity over the years. In the middle of this room was a smooth, mottled stone building that looked like an altar. 7 black iron lamps were set up in a perfect circle around the altar. Each one had the stubs of candles that had clearly been lit a lot of times. Everyone was told to go back to the main room by the sheriff while he thought about what to do next. It was clear that they had found something much bigger than a missing person case. The proof pointed to rituals that the Carter family had been doing for at least 50 years, and maybe even longer. The most important part was still missing, though. How did Henry Walsh get lost? What was going on in that basement that scared Eleanor so much that she ran into it, risking her life? In the middle of the night in the woods? The tour of the underground rooms went on for 2 more hours. As the passages were very complicated and dark, Sheriff Pritchard sent one of his men back to the top to get more flashlights and ropes. It was very easy to get lost in the maze-like darkness. The group took a closer look at the notebooks on the shelves while they waited. A man named Samuel Hodgedge, who was a clerk at the county office and was good at reading old writing, offered to help. See if you can figure out the oldest notes. Samuel found that the records began in January 1873 and were made by someone who only signed as J. Carter, who is likely Thomas's grandpa. The first post talked about how the cellar excavation was finished and how the site was picked by following the signs in the rocks and the position of the stars at the winter solstice, as told by ancestors who came before. There were references to old duties that the family had to keep up to make sure success and safety from the bad things that other families in the area had to deal with. Over the next few years, more notes described what looked like ceremonies that happened on certain dates. They talked about the equinoxes, solstices, and new moons of each season, always with vague descriptions of renewals and gifts that were needed. One note from 1878 went into great detail about the arrival of a lone traveler who had stayed with the family during a snowstorm. The writing. The next few lines were hard to follow, but the last line of this entry said, "The 10th is complete, and the protection continues for another 7 years." Samuel stopped reading out loud when he got to the entry for 1885. He quickly shut the notebook and his face turned pale. When asked what he had read, Samuel just shook his head and said he needed to go outside. He climbed the stairs quickly, making the others lost. In his official statement later on, Samuel would say that this entry described in detail how the family graveyard is set up, and said that not all the people buried there died of things that modern medicine can explain. Along with that, there was a list of 23 names, each with a different sign next to it. The group chose to explore the deeper passages when the man who was sent to the surface came back with more gear. They found that the camera system covered a lot more ground than they thought. There were at least 5 more rooms, and it looked like each one had a special job to do. One only had piles of carefully folded clothes ordered by size. Many of the clothes were worn out and damaged from being wet and old. In a different room, the walls were lined with shelves that held personal items like leather wallets, pocket watches, rings, medallions, and more. All of the items had numbers written on them that went back 50 years. They found the scariest thing when they found a room at the very end of the underground structure. There was something different about this one. The floor was carefully raised and made of flat stone slabs. There were signs of tools. There were marks on the walls from recent work, and the smell of disturbed dirt was strong. They found places in the middle of the room where the ground looked like it had been dug up and then put back down again. There were no headstones or other marks on these, so they weren't really graves, but the way they were set up and the way they looked strongly suggested that something had been buried there. The sheriff had to make a tough choice. He told them to start carefully digging in one of these places. 2 men used tools, and other men used flashlights to see what they were doing. They didn't need to look very far. They found something wrapped in waxed cloth less than a meter below the ground. The cloth was stained and falling apart in some places, but it was still whole enough to keep its shape. The sheriff carefully began taking down the canvas, his hands shaking. Inside, they found proof of their worst fears, and at least one answer to the question that led them there in the first place. Personal items that could be identified right away were inside the tarp. A leather. Henry Walsh was a licensed traveling salesman in the state of Virginia. He had business papers that showed this, and a wallet with the initials H.W. engraved on it. The pocket watch still worked, but showed the wrong time. There was no question that they had found proof of what happened to the missing man, but the find brought up even darker questions. Why was Henry Walsh the only person buried there? Who else might be buried there, and what happened to them? The sheriff thought it was time to talk to Thomas Carter face to face. He got up from the basement with his wallet and watch on him, and then his men came after him. Thomas was still sitting in the main room in the same spot he was hours before. Margaret was next to him, and his 2 kids were standing near the door. When the deputy put the things on the table in front of Thomas, the patriarch Carter finally showed some emotion. His eyes got a little bigger, and he clenched his hands on his knees. "Where's Henry Walsh?" the sheriff asked directly. Thomas was still for almost staring at the things on the table for a minute. When he did speak, it was in a thick voice that sounded like he was giving up. He said the peddler had come to the house looking for a place to stay, and the family had gladly accepted him because that was how things were done in the mountains. Thomas then stopped talking, and the sheriff's words didn't change his mind. There was no sound from Margaret as she started to cry. Tears were running down her face. James and Robert stood still and stared at their father while they waited. Some kind of message. At that very moment, something strange took place. Margaret suddenly stood up and quickly moved away from Thomas. She went to the window and looked out at the mountains that were filled with fog. Then she spoke without turning around. The sheriff had to lean in to hear her because her voice was so low. It was a story that had been told in the Carter family for many years. Margaret told it. This story started a long time ago, with the first Carter family who lived there. They came to the Appalachians in the 1700s. Margaret says that the family's ancestors made a deal with something that had lived in these mountains since the beginning of time. Even though she didn't say pact, it was clear what she meant. The family had to do certain things in return for being safe from disease, having good harvests, and generally being happy. As part of these duties, certain practices had to be performed on certain dates, and sometimes Margaret was just asked to make necessary contributions. She didn't say more about these gifts, but she did say that the family had never meant to hurt anyone and had only done what they needed to do when the chance came up. Margaret was talking when Thomas yelled at her to stop. His voice could be heard through the old house's walls. She went on, though, as if a dam had broken inside her after years of silence. Margaret told Thomas that she had tried to run away from her family twice when she was younger, before she married Thomas. But she was always brought back, and in the end she was. She agreed to play the part because, as she put it, there is nowhere else in the world where we could live without keeping the promise our ancestors made. She talked about how heavy it was to keep that secret, how it kept her up at night, and how it was hard to watch people come to the house knowing what would happen to them. Sheriff Pritchard told the police right away to arrest all of the Carter family's adults. Thomas, Margaret, James, and Robert were arrested, but other men stayed on the land to help with the investigation. In the weeks that followed, bigger groups would come back to dig deeper in both the basement and the family gravesite. Anyone could not have guessed how disturbing what they found would be. It would cause authorities to argue about how to handle revelations that made no sense at all. A series of digs on the Carter farm began 3 days after the arrests. Sheriff Pritchard asked the Virginia State Attorney's Office for help, and a group of expert investigators showed up in. W'll bring tools that can be used for detailed detective work. One of them was a guy named George Pemberton, who had worked on murder cases in Richmond and was known for being thorough and fair. Peyton took over as leader of the digs and set strict rules for keeping track of each find. The work started in the cellar chamber that was the deepest, where Henry Walsh's things had been found. Through the use of ropes and stakes, the team marked the whole area, splitting it into 4 sections that would be carefully dug down. Layers of dirt were carefully sifted through to look for signs of what had happened. It became clear as they dug that the room had been used many times over the years. They found 5 separate areas where the ground had been moved at different times. The color and texture of the soil made these spots easy to spot. In all of these places, they found hidden personal items. It was possible to tell the clothes were from different decades by their styles and fabrics. Wallets with identification papers inside helped them figure out who for. Some other than Henry Walsh. A guy named Ernest Blackwood went missing in 1918 while selling farm tools in the area they were visiting. A woman named Sarah Jennings, a traveling teacher who went missing in 1912 while giving individual lessons in different rural towns, was found. There were also 2 other guys missing in the 1900s. Their names were Marcus Donnelly and William Fletcher. It was just as important what they didn't find. The places that were dug up did not have any remains. There are no bones, pieces, or other biological signs to suggest that human bodies were there. The detectives were very confused by this. Carefully buried personal items showed that someone had done it on purpose, but the lack of any physical remains defied all reasonable explanations. Peyton told the search to be spread to other rooms in the underground complex, hoping that answers were hidden somewhere in the maze of stone. At the same time, at the family graveyard at the top of the hill, an excavation team was going through the marked graves. Even though the investigation was sad, the work was done slowly and with care. The first 3 graves that were dug up had exactly what was expected inside them. Wooden coffins that were falling apart and held bodies that were breaking down in different stages, all in line with the times written on the headstones. These people looked like they were members of the Carter family who had died naturally over the years. The graves that were only marked with wooden crosses, on the other hand, were not marked. The situation got very different. There was nothing in these graves at all. There were boxes there. Some were still in pretty good shape given how long they had been underground, but they were empty inside. There were no bones, clothes, or other signs that they had ever been lived in. It looked like they had been buried without anything inside from the start, for some strange ritual or symbolic reason that no one could figure out. Out of the 27 graves in the graveyard, 13 were empty and had nothing else written on them. Cross made of wood. Peyton became obsessed with figuring out what these finds meant. He spent days going through the notebooks that were found in the basement and trying to match the dates on the notebooks with the dates of the known disappearances and empty graves. An alarming pattern showed up. The dates that the notebooks listed as renewals or donations arriving lined up with times when people had not been seen near the Carter estate, and about 6 months after each of these events, a new grave without a marker was added to the family. Graveyard. The questioning of the Carter family members was very upsetting. Thomas hasn't said a word since he was arrested. He wouldn't answer any questions or even recognize that his interrogators were there. James and Robert did what their father did and sat still for hours with empty stares stuck to the wall. Margaret was the only one who kept talking, but what she said kept getting more confusing and inconsistent. She went back and forth between periods of clarity, during which she gave specific information. She talked about her family's daily routine and rambling times when she talked about voices in the mountains, vows that couldn't be broken, and the land that wanted its due. A doctor was called to check on Margaret's mental health. Dr. Hermann Weiss, a German alienist who worked at a Charleston mental hospital, saw Margaret several times. His report, which was sealed with the case files, said that she had severe dissociation from relationships because of long-term stress. Weiss said that Margaret showed signs of having been under a lot of mental stress for decades, which had caused her personality to become fragmented. He couldn't tell if the stories she told about tribal agreements were made up or based on true family stories that had been twisted by her wounded mind. The cousin who got away, Elena, was brought back to help with the probe. As she went through the house's rooms, she pointed out things and talked about the family's habits. She knew right away which room in the basement had the stone altar, because she had heard Thomas go down there every night of the new moon. Elena said that she had woken up several times in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was wrong. The house seemed to be filled with a heavy presence. She talked about how the Carters used to eat meals in silence before these nights and how Thomas would disappear into the mountains the next morning, but they came back hours later dirty and scratched. The search went beyond just the main house. The 300-acre property was searched by investigators for any other building or place that might hold evidence. They found a partly burned-out barn that had been left empty for years. The burnt beam still had signs of the fire that were written about in the newspaper in 1894. They found the wreckage of a log cabin in the back of the land, close to the edge of the dense forest. In the wreckage, they found worn-out tools and more worn-out notebooks. The notebooks were so badly damaged by moisture that most of the writing was impossible to read. As one of the detectives looked into a deep gully about 1 kilometer from the main house, they found something that made the case even more mysterious. The stones were placed in a circle and were each about 1 meter high. They were half buried in the mossy ground. The stones had symbols carved into them like the ones in the basement and upstairs of the house. The circle was about 10 meters across, and there was proof that fires had been lit there many times over the years in the middle. A thick layer of old ash mixed with the ground to make it. To look at the symbols on the stones, Peyton hired someone who knew a lot about the area's past and Native American cultures. Professor Edmund Hartley of the University of Virginia looked at the marks for 2 days. He had a cautious view. He said that some of the symbols looked a bit like marks made by Cherokee people who lived in the area before they were forced to leave in the 1830s. But some of the images didn't fit with any known Native American beliefs. Hartley suggested that they might be a mix of different influences, possibly made by the European settlers who brought different magical traditions from the old continent. Weeks went by, and the investigation kept going. It became clear that the Carter case was much more complicated and upsetting than a simple crime. There were many levels of family history, and secret customs were kept alive. For generations, and a string of disappearances that goes back at least 50 years. But the most important physical proof was missing. There were no bodies or clear crime scenes, just buried items and structures used for ceremonies. It was very hard for prosecutors to build a strong criminal case, and there were still questions that no one knew the answers to. What did really happen in the Carter basement on those nights of the new moon? Where did the people who were last seen go? Also, what did that really mean? Ancient pact that Margaret said had been keeping the family together for generations. The hearing for the Carter family was set to start in September 1923. That being said, strange things started happening in Woodville and the nearby towns before that. It all started when one of the men who had been digging on the Carter land got sick out of the blue. Harold Mitchum was his name. He was a strong farmer who was 42 years old and had never had any major health issues. He began having high fevers at night, which were accompanied by. He had such bad dreams that he would scream when he woke up, which woke up his whole family. Harold went to the doctor, but the doctors in the area couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. He talked about seeing shadowy figures walking through the mountains and hearing people calling his name in languages he didn't know. Harold lost almost 30 pounds in less than 2 weeks. Because his face was so pale, he wouldn't even leave the house during the day. Sheriff was called by his frantic wife. Police were called by Pritchard for help, but all they could do was tell her to take her husband to a bigger hospital in Richmond. Then other men who had worked on the digs started talking about the same things. They didn't have fevers or other physical problems. Instead, they had severe mental problems like recurring nightmares, a constant feeling of being watched, and uncontrollable anxiety that made it impossible for them to do their daily chores. Patrick Sullivan told the sheriff that he had seen people crossing his land 3 nights in a row, at the same time each night, always going toward the mountains where the Carters' land was. He looked into it with a flashlight, and all he saw were tracks that suddenly disappeared into a clearing. People in the neighborhood quickly heard the stories. A lot of people stopped going near the empty Carter farm, even during the day. Some farmers said their animals were acting strangely in the area, like horses that wouldn't move. There are roads where dogs howl for no reason. There was an old woman from Ivanhoe who had lived in the area for 86 years and told Prosecutor Peaton that her grandparents had been talking about that land and saying something was wrong with it before the Carters got there. Peaton chose to learn more about the past of the property. He went to the state records in Richmond and looked for old papers about that part of Appalachia for days. He found that the land where before the Carter family built their house in 1872, it had been owned by different people. Between 1820 and 1868, records showed that 3 different families tried to settle there, but all of them eventually gave up, citing unspecified difficulties. In the early 1800s, missionaries worked with Cherokee groups in the area and wrote about their experiences in their diaries. In 1818, a minister named Joshua Whitfield wrote in one of these diaries that the local Cherokee avoided a certain valley, hilly area close to the New River. Whitfield says that the natives said this place was inhabited by old spirits that wanted to be respected and kept away from. They held rights on the edge of this land, but they never went into the valley itself, especially when the moon was full. These new historical facts gave the case a whole new depth. Piton started to think that the Carter family might have been linked to the land in some way by settling there. Customs that go back a long time before Europeans came to America. Maybe the lines on the houses, stones, and beams were not originals made by the Carters, but copies of marks made there by people from other cultures in the past. The idea of an ancient pact, which Margaret had brought up many times, might have come from native practices that the Carter family saw and then adopted as family traditions. Margaret Carter's mental health was also getting worse in the county jail. Things kept getting worse. She would often refuse to eat, stay up all night talking to herself in a low voice, and have times when she couldn't even see her own image. The district attorney didn't want to send her to a good mental hospital, even though Dr. Weiss suggested it because he didn't want to lose the only witness who was ready to talk about the family's secrets. She was decided to be medically watched all the time in jail, with a nurse on duty to make sure she didn't hurt herself. On the other hand, Thomas Carter said nothing at all. He ate when he was given food and went to sleep when the lights went out, but he never spoke. Prison guards said he stared out the small window of his cell for hours on end, always at the mountains, even when other buildings blocked his view. It looked like he had lost touch with everything going on around him because his face never showed any feeling. James and Robert did what their father did, which made the prison setting unsettling, where the three men looked like they were doing some kind of silent rite to give up. There was an event in August, less than 1 month before the trial, that would change the whole probe. A group of young guys from town went to the abandoned Carter property at night, even though there were scary stories going around. 5 young guys, between the ages of 18 and 22, were looking for fun and wanted to show that they weren't scared of the stories that had grown up around them. The Spot. They didn't go to the dark house until after midnight, when they were sure there would be no police patrols in the area. They only had the flashlights to help them find their way. Nobody ever gave a full account of what happened that night. 2 of the young guys came back to town early in the morning in such shock that they couldn't put together sentences. They couldn't talk about what they had seen or heard for hours. They said that the group had gone into the house and gone down to the basement. It was in one of the deepest rooms that they heard sounds they couldn't explain. They were like whispers coming from many places at once, getting louder and louder until they were almost unbearable. Then, one by one, their flashlights stopped working. In the dark that followed, they felt like someone was moving around them. The 5 boys were scared and ran back up the stairs, tripping over each other in the dark. They said they lost the other 3 somewhere while they were running away so fast. When? Sheriff Pritchard quickly put together a search party, and the 3 boys were found in different parts of the land. The first was found in the burned-out barn. The second was found near the stone circle in the ravine, and the third was found in the family graveyard, lying among the empty graves. They were all living, but not awake. After going into the basement, they couldn't remember anything when they finally woke up in the hospital. This event made a lot of noise in the area. Parents told their kids they couldn't even go near the road that leads to the Carter land. The mayor of Ville put pressure on the officials to do more drastic things. He suggested that the house be torn down and the basement be sealed off for good. But Prosecutor Piton said the things in question were still important evidence for the trial and should not be thrown away until the case was over. As a compromise, a constant guard was put up at the property's entrance to keep people from getting in without permission. The lawyers for the Carter family used this event as evidence, because they said their clients were victims of mass panic and superstition and not murderers. They said that the community had made up a story about a strange and isolated family turning harmless customs into proof of crimes that had never been proven. As the lawyers pointed out, no body had been found, no cause of death had been proven, and there were no direct witnesses to any crime. There could be good reasons for burying the things. The graves that are empty could be a sign. Monuments, and the notebooks with strange notes might just be the private thoughts of strange people. Peon, the prosecutor, knew that his case would be hard. Without solid physical proof, he would have to build his case on patterns of suspicion and statements from people who the defense could easily brush off as crazy or traumatized. In the weeks before his trial, he went over every detail one last time, looking for anything that could help his case. It was during this review that he discovered an item in the old notebooks that had been missed before. This entry could make all the difference. But before he could talk about this finding, something very interesting would happen, one that would stop the trial from happening. The Y County Jail was the site of a terrible accident on the night of August 26, 1923. The event would affect everyone involved in the Carter case for a long time. At 11 p.m. that night, the guard in charge of the area where the Carters were being held heard a strange sound. From where Margaret is locked up. The chant was low and repeated, and the words were hard for him to make out. It seemed to have a hypnotic, repeating beat. One of the guards, Albert Dawson, went to the cell to check on her. Margaret stood in the middle of the small cell with her back to the door. As she sang, she swayed back and forth a little and raised her hands to shoulder height. Her fingers moved in the air as if they were making something that couldn't be seen. He called her name several times, but she didn't answer. Didn't answer because she was too busy with her secret ritual. Concerned, Albert chose to wake up the doctor who was on call and whose job it was to watch over Margaret based on Dr. Weiss's advice. But 5 minutes later, when he came back with the doctor, the cell was empty. From the outside, the door stayed locked, just the way Albert had left it. There were iron bars around the cell window, making it very hard for adults to get through. There was no rational reason for. Margaret went missing. As Albert ran down the hallway to get the doctor, he swore he hadn't taken his eyes off the cell door for even a second. The alarm went off right away, and the whole jail was searched. Margaret Carter was no longer there. Sheriff Pritchard was woken up at home and got to the jail in 15 minutes. He planned a search of the whole town and the area around it, but Margaret wasn't to be found. It looked like she could not be found. The 2 other rooms where Thomas, James, and Robert were being held were checked right away. The 3 men were in their rooms and looked like they were sleeping soundly. But when the guards woke them up to ask them, all 3 of them had the same smile on their face. It was the first time they had shown emotion since they were arrested. They didn't say a word. They just kept smiling in a creepy way until the guards stopped asking them. At dawn, word got around town that Margaret had been missing, which caused a lot of fear. Many. People in the area thought that something supernatural had happened, and that the Carter family had skills that no one could understand. Others, who were less sure, thought that the prison guards might have been involved, which would mean that Margaret had been quietly freed by people who supported her. Right away, an internal review was started, but there was no proof of either conspiracy or negligence. Albert Dawson was questioned for a long time, but his story stayed the same in every way. A farmer saw Margaret 3 days after she went missing. People who lived about 5 miles away from the old Carter home said they saw a woman walking through the woods early in the morning. She was barefoot and dressed in what looked like jail clothes. She was walking purposefully toward the empty land. The farmer tried to help her by going up to her, but when he called out, the woman quickly vanished into the trees. He was sure it was Margaret Carter because of what he had read about her in the local papers. Right away, Sheriff Pritchard set up a mission to the Carter home. This time, he brought 15 men with him who were well armed. Some of them had been in the army during the First World War and knew how to handle dangerous situations. The guards who were stationed at the door told them that they had not seen anyone enter or leave the estate since they got there at noon. The house was still dark and quiet in the August sun, just like it had been when the investigation was over. The group split up to search the whole property in a planned way. It was on top of a hill. Cemetery was the first thing they found. One of the empty graves that was found during the investigation had been filled with new dirt. The wooden cross that marked that spot had been taken off and put next to the pile of dirt upside down. The ground was wet, which should have kept clear footprints of anyone who had worked there lately, but there were none to be seen. The sheriff told them to open the grave right away. With shovels, the men quickly moved the newly put dirt away. Not as much. They dug less than a meter and found the empty wooden box from the first escape. But it wasn't empty anymore. Margaret Carter was carefully placed inside, with her hands crossed over her chest. She was dead, and her face looked calm, like she was just sleeping. There were no signs of violence or stress that could be seen. Even though she was still in her prison outfit, her feet were clean. They didn't have any of the dirt and scratches that you'd expect from someone who had walked miles through the mountains. The doctor who looked into Margaret's body could not clearly show what caused her death. There were no signs of suffocation, poisoning, internal damage, or any other illness that could have caused her death. It seemed like her heart had stopped beating. Only one strange thing was found during the check. And even though she was found in a grave, her body temperature was much lower than what would be normal. Even though it had been hot and muggy, she felt like she had been out in the cold for hours. Whole thing. Along with the people who found Margaret's body, another group that had gone down into the house's basement also found something disturbing. The notepads that were left on the stone tables were not the same. Before, some pages were blank, but now they had writing on them in a handwriting that experts would eventually confirm was Margaret's. The entries were made within the last 3 days, which includes the time she was last seen leaving jail and when she was found in the grave. What was written in these new posts was very upsetting. Margaret had written about her trip home and how she had been called by sounds she knew to be those of her family ancestors. She talked about how she needed to finish a cycle that had been broken by her time in prison in order to achieve a final duty that would protect future generations. The last few lines, written in handwriting that was getting worse, said, "The pact demands balance. What was taken must be." The prosecutor Peaton was very upset by what was going on. "I will rest now with the other guardians, and the land will be happy for another cycle. May the living learn not to disturb what they do not understand." He worked on the case for months because he thought he was dealing with a family of crooks who had killed many people over many years. But now he was facing something that didn't fit into any of his groups. How could he explain how Margaret got out of a locked room? Cell. What did she do to get on the land without the guards seeing her? Who dug the hole and put her body in it? And most importantly, how could Margaret have written those notes if she was meant to be running away and then being killed? It never came with the answers. It was no longer possible to bring charges against Thomas James and Robert Carter. Without Margaret as a witness, without clear physical proof of murder, and with a string of unexplained events that would make any lawsuit less credible, the official charges were dropped by the district attorney. In September, the 3 men were freed on the condition that they would never return to the family farm and would go live with the county. Without a word of protest, Thomas, James, and Robert agreed to the terms. They got out of jail on a cloudy morning with only small bags of personal items. Witnesses said they walked straight to the train station, bought tickets for different places across the country, and then left, with no turning back. They didn't come back at all. It was found that Thomas died in Oregon in 1934, James died in Montana in 1941, and Robert died in California in 1947. The Carter line is now officially over because none of them got married or had any known children. The building was left empty. The state of Virginia tried to sell it several times over the next few decades, but no one was interested after seeing the site. There were still reports of lights being seen in the empty houses' windows, sounds coming from the basement, even though the door was locked, and a heavy feeling that hit anyone who stayed on the land for too long. The land was eventually turned into a forest preserve, and the house was left to fall apart naturally, becoming a part of the harsh Appalachian scenery. In the years after the Carter case was over, many people tried to figure out what had really happened on that remote piece of Appalachian land. George Peton, the prosecutor, was unable to. He tried to forget what he had seen and spent a lot of his life looking into cases like this that had happened in other parts of the United States. He learned that it was common to find families in remote mountain areas keeping secret customs that had been passed down from generation to generation. These traditions often mixed parts of different religions and cultures into unique ways of doing things that were hard to put into a single category. In 1927, Peton wrote a separate academic paper about the Carter case and sent it to a small folklore magazine, talking about individual names or places. He thought that some remote communities formed what he called territorial pacts, which were ways of thinking in which the land itself was seen as a spirit that needed to be appeased through certain practices. Peton said that these practices often included complicated ceremonies, gifts meant to represent different things, and a family system with levels where certain members of each generation were chosen to receive secret information. At the time, the story didn't get much attention, being. Academic world mostly ignored it because they thought it was too speculative. But many years later, anthropologists and historians who study rural American customs would find Pemberton's work again and realize how important it was. He had written about a real thing that happened on the edges of American society, mostly in places that were far away from other people and didn't have many people. So, practices that would have been quickly stopped in more crowded areas could stay alive. Sheriff Daniel Pritchard, who was in charge of the first, looked into it and retired in 1930. In his last years, he lived in a small house near Whitville and only talked about the Carter case with very close friends. In private talks, Pritchard said he had never been able to make sense of the difference between what his eyes had seen and what his mind told him was possible. Throughout his life, he wrote in a notebook. And after he died in 1949, his family found a lot of ideas and unanswered questions about the Carter family, and thoughts on what truth is and what can't be explained. Ella Lenina, the cousin who got away from the estate, tried to start over in a place other than the woods of Virginia. She moved to Richmond and got a job as a seamstress. Eventually, she married a quiet businessman who didn't ask too many questions about her past. Ella Lenina rarely talked about her time with the Carters, but people who knew her said she could never sleep on new moon nights and was awake and restless until dawn. She wrote her daughter a short note before she died in 1956. It said, "Some secrets are too heavy to bear, but even more dangerous to reveal fully. Live in the light, away from the mountains, and never try to understand what your ancestors left behind." Over the years, the Carter estate became a local legend that changed and grew. Older people in Y County told younger people stories, and each story added new dramatic elements that made it harder to see what really happened. It was said that the house was haunted by angry ghosts, and that the basement led to other worlds. They said that anyone who stayed the night on the land would either go crazy or disappear forever. People who were interested in the abandoned land stayed away for many years because of these stories. They created an informal no-go zone around the land. When the American counterculture became interested in mysticism and supernatural events in the 1960s, the Carter farm got a lot of attention again. Young people who liked to go on adventures, do a cult study for fun, and even some more. Some brave academics tried to get to the spot. The park guards in charge of the preservation area stopped most of them from doing so. Those who were able to get inside often said they felt nervous, like they were being watched, and lost their way around, even in broad daylight. They also had an overwhelming desire to leave as soon as possible. In 1973, exactly 100 years after the Carter House was built, something very important happened. A group of college anthropology students who were studying Appalachian folklore got official permission to take pictures of the property's remains. Over the course of 3 days, they camped nearby, taking pictures of the house's ruins, which were already badly damaged by time, and making notes on how the buildings were set up. On the 3rd day, one of the students went down into the basement, which could still be reached even though it was partly collapsed. After 20 minutes, he came out feeling very upset and holding a notebook he had, inside one of the deep rooms. Even though the notebook wasn't very old, definitely not from the Carters' time, it had new notes in a number of different handwritings. It was weird to read the entries. Over the years, many people have visited the property and had strange experiences. Some have even admitted to doing their own rituals in the underground rooms to try to connect with whatever the Carters had been worshiping there. The group of kids right away. They left the place and gave the notebook to the police. A search was made, but it was never possible to find out who left the notes or when they were written. Because of what happened, security has been tightened. The door to the basement has been permanently sealed with concrete, and barbed wire has been put up around the house to keep people out. There were warning signs put up about the dangers of the structure, and making it clear that anyone breaking in would be prosecuted. During the 1980s and 1990s, as a type of habit, when the people who had been there at the time of the events died, the Carter case went from being a true story to a pure myth. Fans of horror and the supernatural wrote sensationalized versions of the story, with each one being more detailed and less true than the last. There were parts of TV shows about unsolved secrets that were about the Carters, and the truth and fiction were often hard to tell apart. The difference between truth and folklore became blurry. Not until the early 1920s did real academics start to look at it again, using the right method to solve the case. The sealed county records were open to the public for the first time in 80 years, as the original court order said they should be. Historians from the University of Virginia were able to get into them. The papers showed a story that was much more nuanced and complicated than what most people thought. Yes, there was proof that the Carter family did some strange things. There were some unexplained deaths connected to the land, but there were also big holes in the story and events that didn't make sense. Documentation and coming to a decision, based on feelings and suspicions, rather than solid proof. Professor Dr. Rachel Montgomery, one of the historians who helped with this reevaluation, wrote a book about the Carter case in 2012 that was based on a lot of careful study. She said that the family had kept secret customs that had been passed down for generations. These traditions may have included parts of Cherokee practices that the family had seen before the Cherokee were forced to leave the area. Even so, Montgomery also said that many of the most serious accusations could not be proven because there was no solid physical proof. She said the Carter case wasn't really about specific crimes, but about how small, isolated groups create and keep cultural identities that can seem dangerous to bigger groups. Montgomery's work caused a lot of discussion. He brought scientific rigor to a case that had been muddled by decades of sensationalism, which was praised by some experts. Others didn't like what. They saw it as an attempt to normalize actions that had led to many disappearances and strange deaths, no matter the culture. Even now, there is still no clear answer to the discussion, which may be a reflection of how unclear the Carter case is in general. The house itself is still empty and alone. In the 1920s, the house finally fell apart totally, leaving behind only the stone foundations and the rubble that was covered in weeds. The basement that was sealed is still hidden under layers of concrete and earth. The hilltop graveyard is still there, and you can still see the oldest headstones, even though they are covered in moss and lichen. People who are interested still try to visit the site every once in a while, but it's hard to get to because of the thick forest and lack of marked trails. Those who do make it there are often let down because they only find normal ruins and silence in the forest, not the spooky atmosphere that the legends describe. More than 100 years after the events that shook Y County, the Carter family story is still one of the most mysterious and upsetting cases in the history of the Appalachians. Now that official records are available to the public, they give us a fascinating look into a time when families could live on the edges of society and keep customs that were against the rules of the time. But even though everyone has full access to these papers, some basic questions have never been answered in a way that makes sense. How did Henry Walsh and the other people who went missing near the Carter land really end up? Even though despite decades of research and guesswork, their deaths have never been proven beyond a doubt. The fact that no remains were found in the digs has left a hole in the case that no theory has been able to fully fill. Some people say that the bodies were either destroyed or hid in places that have never been found before in Appalachia's vast forests. Other people think the people may have left on their own, and the Carter family may have just kept their things for reasons that made sense, within the rules of their own culture. It's also still not clear what the ancestors' deal that Margaret Carter kept talking about means. Was it just a set of beliefs passed down through the family, a way of making sense of the world through rituals and traditions? Or was there something more real going on here? Were these practices connected to forces or knowledge that modern science still can't put into the right categories? Since there are no clear answers, there are many possible meanings, ranging from the logical to the very spiritual. And maybe this: there should be some uncertainty in a case that has always been on the edge of what can be explained and what can't be explained. The signs on the beams, stones, and underground walls have never been fully figured out. Over the years, people who study linguistics, Native American history, and the occult have looked at photos and pictures of these symbols, but they still can't agree on where they came from or what they mean. Some parts look a bit like Cherokee markings, others like things from old European cultures, and some look nothing like anything written down in any known culture. It's possible that the Carters made up their own system of symbols by combining ideas from different sources to make something that was unique to their family. Margaret's disappearance from the locked cell is still the part of the story that no one can explain. No logical reason could be found in any of the investigations that were done at the time and later ones. There were no secret tunnels, no guards working together, and no strange things going on. Something she could have done to get away. Still, she was found dead on the family farm a few days later, in the strangest way possible. More than any other part of the case, this one event has led to decades of discussion about things that are beyond our normal understanding. Even though the story was never fully forgotten, the people of W County eventually got over the trauma of the Carter case. Families of the men who worked on the first digs still live in the area, and some of them have children who are still young. Children and grandchildren say that their grandparents or great-grandparents refuse to talk about specifics of what happened during those times, even with close family members. People in the community know that some things should stay in the past, hidden as deeply as the secrets the Carters kept for generations. The property has slowly been taken over by the forest that has always been around it, making it a natural part of the Appalachian scenery. Visitors, every once in a while, who manage to. People who find the site often say they feel very sad, but this could be a normal reaction to any abandoned place where people lived and died. There is no clear evil coming from the ruins. There is only the heavy quiet of places that time has forgotten. Plants grow between the stone walls. Animals dig holes in the rubble. and life goes on without thinking about the tragedies that happened there in the past. Since podcasts and documentaries have made people interested in real crime and mystery stories again, the Carter case has reached new people. Every generation reads the story again and tries to figure out what it means in light of today's world. For some, it's a story that shows how dangerous it is to be alone and follow strict tribal beliefs. Some people see it as proof that there are parts of being human that can't be explained by science. Still, others find it interesting because it's about a strange family that lived by rules that only they knew. There aren't many things we know for sure about the Carter family, but very important. They lived on that land by themselves for decades, staying away from their neighbors and the social rules of the time on purpose. They did routines that they thought were important and carefully wrote down what they did in notebooks that we still don't understand 100 years later. People who were close to their land went missing for reasons that were never fully explained. When the authorities finally stepped in, they found a web of beliefs and practices that were too complicated to explain in an easy way. Sorting into groups. The Carter case may have taught us more about the boundaries of our knowledge and understanding than about the specifics of their crimes, whether they were real or made up. We live in a time that is proud of its scientific logic and complex legal systems, but there are still cases that can't be fully explained. There are gaps in our knowledge of what it's like to be human, especially when that experience happens on the cultural or geographical edges of society. The Carters lived in one of. These gaps, and what they leave behind, are a warning that the world has more mysteries than our theories can explain. The Carter story is important to people who live in Y County and the nearby Appalachian towns for many reasons. Local history is what connects today's youth to its past. It reminds us of the hard times and strange things that life was like in that area 100 years ago. It also shows how important it is not to judge people too quickly who live in different ways. About the dangers of both superstition and too much doubt, as well as the importance of solid proof before conviction. The records are still in Whoville, and any serious researcher who wants to look at the original papers can do so. The old, yellowed pictures show the house as it looked in 1923, sad and big against the mountain background. The notebooks were carefully kept in acid-proof boxes and still have the mysterious notes that were written in different handwritings over the years. Maps with lots of information about the cave. System show how much work the family put into the dig, and the witness statements that were carefully typed up by court reporters keep the words of those who were there. Based on the records we have, this is the story we can tell. There are a lot of gaps and unclear parts in the story that probably will never be cleared up. There isn't a satisfying ending or big secret that ties up all the open ends. That might be a good idea. Not all stories are. We're meant to have neat, satisfying ends. There are stories that are meant to tell us that not everything can be explained, put into categories, and filed away neatly. If you can even call it that, the Carter family curse wasn't magical in the scary way that folktales make it sound. There was something deeper and more subtle about it. Traditions that have been passed down without question for generations carry a lot of weight. The inability to break habits set up decades before we were born, and the loneliness that comes with it. Strange things into dark secrets. It was the curse of living outside of time to keep old traditions alive in a world that was changing quickly around us. Eventually, the old and new worlds would meet, and terrible things would happen. Some people think of the Carter family when they drive along the twisting roads of the Appalachians in Virginia, past Whoville and up to the higher mountains. Their land is still there, but it's hidden in a forgotten valley, and is slowly going back to being wild like it was before. It was briefly taken back. People still tell stories in bars and at family events, and each version is a little different from the last. Facts and stories mix until they are hard to tell apart. Some older residents still nervously look into the woods on nights with a new moon, when the mountains are very dark and quiet. They wonder if the Carters are really gone, or if something of their spirit still lingers on the land they lived on for so long. Thanks for coming along with us on this trip through one. This is one of the darkest and most mysterious stories in Appalachia. Feel free to share your own experiences with places or families that seem to hold secrets from the past if this story touched you in any way. If you subscribe, you'll get more disturbing stories from American past that are hard to explain. Don't forget that not all riddles are meant to be solved. Some people are only here to tell us that the world is much stranger and more complicated than our simple categories make it seem. As we close this dark chapter when we study Appalachian history, it's important to think about what the Carter family story really means to us now, more than 100 years after the upsetting events of 1923. This isn't just a story about crimes that haven't been solved or strange customs that have been kept secret. It's a story about how fragile human knowledge is when it comes to the truly unknown, how events that can't be explained can change whole communities, and how heavy secrets that last for generations can be. People who are related to the people who lived. People who lived through those events still live in Y County and the nearby towns. Many people would rather not talk about the Carter case in public, keeping a respectful distance from a past that still makes them feel uneasy. But when they're alone, away from records and cameras, some of them tell parts of stories that their grandparents told them. They talk about nights when the mountain wind seemed to carry strange whispers of animals that would act strangely when they got close to that land of people who had stepped foot on those cursed places had scary dreams. One of the most interesting things that came out of the latest study is that the Carter family's habits were not completely unique. At least 6 other families in different parts of Appalachia kept similar secret customs during the same time period, according to historians. There was no proof that these people knew or talked to each other, but they all had things in common. Things that there were private cemeteries with unique graves, rituals performed on certain times that were linked to lunar and seasonal cycles, and stories in the area about pacts made with ancient earth forces. The Carters may have been a part of a larger cultural phenomenon that lived on the edges of rural American society, but not much is known about it. In the 17th and 18th centuries, European settlers brought customs with them to America. These families may have been the last ones to carry on those traditions, things that were gradually. Most of their families left them as they became part of mainstream American society, but some of them stayed in small, remote areas where modern life moved more slowly. With their steep mountains and far-flung valleys, the Appalachians were the right place to keep these old traditions alive. It wasn't until 2003 that the Carter land became a part of Jefferson National Forest Park. As part of this process, archaeologists made notes on all the remaining buildings before letting them fall apart naturally. The locked basement hasn't been used in years, and the Forest Service says it can't be opened again. The choice was made in part because of concerns about the safety of the structure. But there was also a rumor that workers on the incorporation process had unpleasant experiences on the property that made them not want to disturb the site anymore. In 2018, a group of independent documentary directors got special permission to shoot at the burned-down Carter estate. Their plan was to make a careful history documentary that told the family's story by separating fact from fiction. The crew stayed at the spot for 5 days and talked to local historians, filmed the ruins and cemetery, and looked through the Ville's archives. The project was never finally done. According to public comments from the producers, the documentaries were canceled because of ongoing technical issues with the recording equipment and creative disagreements within the team. But sources that aren't official say that the group, during filming, that they couldn't understand, which made them not want to continue with the project. Genealogists and family historians are now interested in the Carter Cemetery, which is an interesting development. Through ancestry research, many people have found distant ties to the Carter family over the years. They are often shocked and upset to learn of this link to one of the most famous cases in Appalachian history. Some of these long-lost relatives have been to the grave looking for some kind of link to their family history. Most say it was an emotionally complicated experience, with a mix of historical interest, sadness over the hard lives their ancestors lived, and discomfort over the unsolved riddles surrounding the Carter name. A theory that has been getting a lot of attention lately says that the Carter family may have been very alone and had strange customs because of undiagnosed mental illness that had been passed down through the generations. Psychiatrists who looked at some of the behaviors mentioned in old records are similar to those seen in people with paranoid schizophrenia or shared delusional disorder, which is also known as pholia. Many things about the case can be explained more normally from a medical point of view, but it still doesn't answer the questions about the disappearances and the lack of physical proof. On the other hand, not even the most optimistic psychological explanation can explain everything about the case. Margaret going missing from the fact that her last writings were very accurate, even about things that hadn't happened yet when they were meant to have been written, and the fact that many different witnesses said the same thing about strange things happening on the property decades after the Carters left. These things don't make sense on their own, and people are still guessing about parts of reality that science doesn't fully understand. The Carter story is a complicated part of Wyo County residents' sense of who they are as a place. On the one hand, it's an interesting attraction for tourists that brings them to the area, which is good for the business. On the other hand, being known for such a dark and unfinished story makes people feel uneasy. Setting clear limits has helped the community keep this careful balance. People can talk about and tell the story, but they should always do so with respect for the lives that were lost or hurt, and with the knowledge that the full truth may never be found. When we think about the last 100 years, the Carter family is a scary reflection of ourselves. They lived by rules that only they fully understood. They were alone in a land they chose to call their own, and kept secrets that they thought were holy. In the end, this shut-off and secrecy caused disaster. How their family broke up, and how their name became a synonym for dark mystery. It is a story that warns us about the risks of living alone and away from other people. But it also tells us that not everything that is. Being different or mistaken is always bad. There are a lot of stories in the Appalachians. Some are told out loud, while others are kept quiet and told only in close groups. There are hundreds of stories like the Carters that make up the rich and complicated past of this area. This story makes us think about what we think we know, what we don't know, and how to stay humble in the face of mysteries that still exist, even though we have a lot of information and can do complex science research. So, as the sun goes down over the Virginia mountains and the shades between the trees get longer, there is silence at the Carter estate. The stone bases sink into the ground slowly. The locked cellar keeps its secrets hidden under layers of concrete and time, and the graveyard on top of the hill continues to watch over the forgotten valley by itself. The Carters are long gone, having been blown away by the winds of time, but their influence is still felt in the land they lived on for a long time. And maybe that is right. Maybe some places are, meant to hold the memories of the people who lived there, to keep the questions that were never answered alive, and the mysteries that tell us that the world is always stranger than we think it is. As much as the records allow, this is the story of the Carter family, told in all its truth and completeness. Thank you so much for reading this far about one of the scariest stories in American history. These kinds of stories need to be told, not to sensationalize past disasters, but to keep historical memory alive and remind us of how complicated life is. If you liked this in-depth look into real historical riddles, please follow the channel now. There are many more scary mysteries unsolved cases, and dark tales from American past that we have yet to discover. We bring you new, well-researched stories about the worst parts of the past every week. To make sure you don't miss any, turn on the bell. Episodes. Share this story in the comments if it interested you and like it if it did. Also, share other stories about families or places with strange pasts. Your participation helps us keep bringing these lost stories to light. Question everything and keep your curiosity alive until the next probe.